Good morning, everyone. This is Wednesday, 10 a.m., 10:05 to be exact, and that means that our team, Holthe Immigration Law, sponsored by Canadian Immigration Institute, is doing another episode of the Canadian Immigration Live Q&A. And we have three Canadian immigration lawyers today, Mark, Alicia, and I, and we're here to answer your toughest question on immigration. But before we dive to those questions, one thing I wanted to ask Mark and Alicia, how are you guys doing?
We were just recording an episode of the Canadian Immigration Podcast this morning, and it's nice. And we're talking about the weather. It's nice that summer is finally here.
Yes.
I played in a pickleball tournament on Saturday, and it was the first time it was really warm out. And I definitely changed a few shades of color after being outside in the sun. But it sure is nice to feel that sun. Super nice.
Yeah, my husband and I, so we went out camping. We're diehard campers, and we were in the tent on May long weekend, and we were, I was cold. It was like maybe 2 or 3 degrees. It was damp. It had been raining all the time, and so it was pretty cold on May long weekend. And then it was just like the switch was flipped, and now it's summer. And so we went out camping last weekend, and it was, 23 degrees. It was beautiful outside, and all the flowers are in bloom. The trees are all in bloom right now. It smells amazing outside. The poplar fluff is flying. It looks like it's snowing. So it's really nice right now in Alberta.
That's awesome. I was just hosting my mom, and she left yesterday. So her first comment when she landed in Germany was that I'm already missing the Canadian weather because it's raining and it's all gloomy in Germany and in Poland, and that's pretty typical for Europe, I understand. Because I remember the time when I used to live in Poland, it was like always rainy and foggy, and I think like only
Overcast.
for 3 days we had rain when they first came to Canada, like uh, 2 weeks ago, and then since then it was just sunshine all day. All right, so we start with the weather, but then we also transition to the essence, and the essence is our viewers. Okay, and so our viewers saying good morning. So Trevor says good morning. And then we have Levine, who says good morning. And then we have Jubaid saying good morning from Toronto. And happy to see all three smiling faces in one frame. Majid says hello to you, Mark.
Hello, Majid.
Yes,
Majid's from my language class. He
awesome.
is, one of my students. Yeah.
Awesome. And we already have one super chat. Okay, so if you guys ready, we'll transition to the questions right away.
Yeah, let's dive in.
Okay, so this one is from Victor. So he says, my postgrad expires in July, applied for study permit in January, and still don't have a response. Can I work full-time, part-time if no decision is made by July? My intake starts July 7th.
And so, Victor, take a look at the rules on study permit holders. So if you still have a valid PGWP, if your work permit, your open work permit is still valid, then you are still authorized to work. I don't know exactly what day your PGWP expires in July, but you cannot start working under the terms of a study permit if you are not actively in your
Enrolled.
studies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And lots of people make that mistake too, especially when they come to Canada first. Maybe they come a month or month and a half early before school starts. And then they assume that the study permit authorizes them to get a job and start working as soon as they get here. And that's not the case. So you have to be really careful.
Yep. All right, we'll move on to the question from Yamin. And Yamin says, I will soon be on unemployed status with a work permit application in process. Will a temporary layoff affect my work permit application?
So, Yiming, maybe this is a good time to say these are all immigration questions that we are trying to give kind of general immigration information about. But when we're looking at immigration advice, we need to know quite a bit more about your situation and the very specific details of what's going on, the timing of what's going on, what kind of implied status, how long ago did you file that work permit application, what kind of work permit was it? Was it employer specific, right? Is this a LMIA based work permit? Are you under some other sort of like international mobility employer specific work permit that's LMIA exempt? And what's going on with this temporary layoff? Because normally, if you are on temporary layoff, you are not employed. And if you are looking at trying to use your Canadian high skilled work experience for express entry or for maybe one of the PNPs, a layoff can definitely affect your eligibility for a program, especially if it's affecting your length of time. So if you need to show I've got 1 year, 52 weeks of full time high skilled work or 6 months or whatever it is for the program, a layoff can definitely affect your status. So we would need to know quite a bit more about what's going on and the timing of everything and what types of work permits are involved here.
And as we were answering those questions, we have a few more comments. I wanted to give a shout out to Felix. We don't know where you tune in from, Felix, so we'll just leave it at this. Good evening from here. So I assume it's somewhere in Asia or Europe. We also have a good morning from Ankit. And we also have Hang from Cambodia, which becomes quite rare. And we've discussed this with Alicia. A couple of years ago, we used to have people from all over the world. Now it
All
seems
over the
to be
world.
more in Canada focus. Okay. And we already have a thank you from Yiming for picking his question. Let's move on. Okay, so this next one is from Arinze. So as an inland applicant whose PR is in process, but this applicant has applied for the spousal after receiving the acknowledgement of receipt, but currently have a job offer in an in-demand sector, is it advisable that she raises a web form to speed up the process?
Well, one thing I can tell you is that I don't know any circumstance where a web form would speed up any process in these days. So processing times are the way they are. When you have a tremendous demand on services and there's a lot of people applying all at the same time, that's why we are seeing processing times increase astronomically. And when we have a government that is trying to reduce the number of temporary residents and reduce the number of permanent residents in Canada, if they say they're only going to land so many people each year, then the processing times are the only thing that's going to be affected. If a person has validly submitted their application and there are just way more people submitting than there are room to land in that particular year, then it means processing times are going to increase. And that's why we're seeing things climb as they are, both at the federal level and the provincial level. And so, Alicia, I don't know if you want to tackle the first part of that question. It's always tricky, Arinze, because like Alicia said, there's a lot of factors that it's hard to give specific advice in these types of live streams. And so we strongly encourage people who have significant questions, significant issues like this, not just requesting information, but need legal advice, that you book a consult, and then we can take the time to do it. And if you're wondering, well, consult, is it even worth it? Well, go check out the Google reviews and you'll see what people say about the consults.
Yeah. We do have a few more shout outs. So Armel says hello from Burkina Faso. And then we do have one from Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah. Like we keep seeing the same faces all over again. And that's really good. Okay. So the next question that I wanted to pick up is this from Raquel. So I have 2 years left on my postgrad and 1 month on Tier 2 job contract. Will that affect applying for the spousal open work permit?
Oh.
So I assume Raquel wanted to have her spouse apply for the spousal while she still is employed in a Tier 2 job.
At the time, at the time in which you apply for the spousal open work permit, the required conditions need to be in place. And so if you, at the time in which you file, no longer have a job or job offer, then the spousal open work permit can absolutely get rejected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so keep in mind there are all new rules in terms of which spouses of workers can apply for open spousal work permits. And it is really difficult now because generally the principal applicant, so the person who is the anchor family member, needs to have a work permit that's going to be valid for 16 months. And you've got to be in one of those listed tier 2 or tier 3 occupations. So if that anchor family member has their tier 2 job, great, but you've got to make sure that you still can show that your work permit is going to be valid for the next 16 months and that you've got that job lined up in the specific tier category. And then the spouse has to, of course, meet their eligibility requirements. You've got to show the marriage certificate, as well as a status, so, and temporary intent. So be careful on this one, because if you only have 1 month left on that contract, unless you're able to renew that contract, it looks like it's not going to meet eligibility parameters.
All right, this one is from Batman. Regarding Mark Carney's comments in the mandate letter attracting global talents and the US professionals, do you see any programs or PR pathways launching for H-1B workers from the US?
Okay, I'll jump in on this one. At this stage, I don't. So it's anything's possible. I'll always caveat, but I don't at this stage, largely because they don't need more open work permit holders like the H-1B category. There just are not pathways. The market is saturated with open work permit holders. In this case, mostly post-grad work permits, spousal open work permits. So anything along these lines is going to be much more targeted. And when they talk about attracting global talent, yes, I think of our global talent stream, expanding that. Maybe there's different occupations that are going to be focusing, that the government's going to focus their attention on. We know that tech has taken a real hit in Canada, and our STEM is really SEM right now with our category-based draws, because they've stripped away, by and large, a lot of the tech categories. So I think it's going to be much more strategic. Now, with that being said, I'm going down to Denver later in June to attend the American Immigration Lawyer Conference. And I think Igor, Alicia, and myself, we can attest to the fact that there are so many Americans, citizens, yes, permanent residents and workers that are looking to move to Canada. Now, whether it's purely the geopolitical kind of situation, or if it's the political situation in the US, we don't know for certain. But all we know is that our consultations are filling up with individuals looking to see if Canada might be a better fit for them. And so that's one of the reasons I'm heading down south. And I think our Prime Minister, Carney, still getting used to that. We've had Trudeau for so long. Prime Minister Carney, I think this is one of the things that he's signaling, that Canada is open. Now, at the end of the day, we know from the steps that the Liberal government is taking, they want 1 million people out of the country by the end of 2025. And so who they are attracting are not individuals in low-paying jobs. They're not low-wage individuals. In fact, they're doing everything they can to close off all options for them to renew their work permits and stay. They want them to go home. Who they're talking about is highly skilled, highly technical professionals, and that type of those types of candidates. Alicia?
Yeah, if I were to guess, I would say they're looking at healthcare. So they're looking at healthcare providers. I know the province of BC is trying to attract more doctors, and they're looking at, can we get some more US doctors or medical professionals up into the province? And then we also know that there are opportunities potentially for university researchers. So kind of that type of level of research, scientific, healthcare related occupations, my guess would be that's the direction that they're trying to directly encouraged to come from the US.
Perfect. We'll move on to the next question. This one from Akashdeep. So going from an undergrad program to graduate studies in the same university, will my current study permit be valid for the graduate program, or he needs to get a new one?
That's a great question. Go ahead,
And so
Alicia.
Akashdeep, take a look at the new program requirements, and I think Igor's probably trying to pull it back up in the background here. But it used to be that IRCC said, there's a way that you could just notify them online to say, here's my new program, as long as it's at the same DLI, and as long as your study permit is still valid, you could change within the programs and just notify them after the fact. Now, most of the time, the rule is that you need to get a new study permit before you can start that program of studies. And there is a whole kind of drop-down list based on your situation here.
Yeah. So take a look at this information. Just type study permit, change of school, and then it will take you to this page. All right. The next question is from Ankit. Can my dependent spouse working in Tier 4 apply for the Francophone Mobility Program in a separate file, so file a separate application? And can I apply for the spousal open work permit working in Tier 2 in Enunog, as my postgrad is expiring this December and I just cannot help, but I'll press this button.
Yeah. This is a consult, Ankit. Yeah. And I think it's probably best we leave it at that. There's too many moving parts here, my friend, to be able to try to address this. And just to remind everyone too, we generally really try to choose the questions that are going to be the most benefit to everyone that's attending. Mm-hmm. And when people ask specific questions like you did, Ankit, we do try to identify some aspects so we can provide some value. But it's really hard for us to give you advice that you can rely upon. And we would be remiss to do that. Like it would be a mistake for us to do that without fully understanding the situation. And so, yeah, we'd encourage you to book a consult on that one, Ankit.
Yeah. Next one is a quickie. So can I apply for permanent residence unimplied status?
Sure.
Yeah. So I had a very interesting situation, Mark, yesterday. So I had a consult with someone who applied for, I don't remember exactly what was the permit that this person applied for, but essentially, okay. So it was a mess of a situation. So the person was studying and then decided to switch school, notified RCC through the web form using the old method. RCC eventually saw the notification that he changed school. And then the person applied for the postgrad work permit, and I don't recall exactly the circumstances, but in essence, what was happening. So the person was on maintained status, pending the decision on the application, but the application was withdrawn, and so the graduation came at a time when the implied status was already in place, but then because the application was withdrawn, RCC refused the pending application, saying that your previous application was withdrawn and your next application was submitted while you were without immigration status.
Without status, yeah.
And it's it's very also important to understand, like, if they actually accepted your application, if they started processing it, or they may return it as incomplete and deem it as never been submitted. So yeah, it's always tricky.
The other thing too, Jenny, is it depends on what kind of permanent resident application you're making. So we know that, on express entry, then it may not affect your eligibility if you've already met your 1-year CEC and you have FSW, and as long as you are not breaking the law, as long as you are complying with your temporary intent and your ability to remain in Canada, then that might be okay. But we know for some provinces like Alberta, if you've got maintained status, that could seriously jeopardize your application under AAIP. So it really depends what kind of permanent resident application you are looking at filing, whether it's a PNP or whether you're looking at a federal program.
Yeah. I'll pull up one more question from the chat before we go to super chats. So this one is from Ryan. So Ryan applied for the ECA in February 2020 and then had some personal commitments, so he could not use the WES results. And then he requested a new duplicate copy from WES with a new issue date. And so the question is, can I submit a fresh express entry application with the extended duplicate ECA, which states that the ECA is extended by another 5 years?
I haven't seen one of these, I'll be honest, yet. I haven't seen an official extension, so I'm not sure exactly what this looks like. But the reality is, if you followed the proper process, Ryan, and the new document you have has a new issue date, then that theoretically should reset the 5-year period. However, I would like to look at that document to make sure that it's, because there's a lot of different things that these educational credential assessment agencies do. They're not all just designed to work for Canada. they do it for other countries and they have different processes. And so I'd want to make sure that what you have legitimately is what would be considered a valid ECA for the purposes of IRCC. And without looking at it, that's not something that I'd be able to confirm. I don't know, Alicia, if you've had experience with this.
Um, I've had one client who had one of them, and my gut reaction is if there is any doubt whether this is going to be accepted as a valid document or not, just get it redone. Just get a brand new one, properly paid for, properly issued, so that you are not in a situation where you finally manage to get an ITA and you file your EAPR and you pay your fees, and all of a sudden the IRCC says, well, wait a minute, that education credential assessment that you used was actually expired, and everything just falls down and you lose your application. I just don't think it's worth it. So I think if there's any doubt, just get a new one.
And it's
And
also
go ahead. I was just going to say, Igor, I'm just pulled it up on my screen here, and I went to the West site, for instance, and it says, how do I renew my ECA? And it does seem to follow the pattern that that Ryan has indicated, at least the instructions. Say if it's expiring or nearing expiry, you can extend the validity of the report by ordering an extra copy. Log into your account and from your dashboard, select order duplicate. Ordering an extra copy will extend the expiry date by another 5 years, which, okay, that's fine, but it always surprises me when they have those kinds of instructions, because the whole nature of an expiry date is that somehow the education is maybe no longer as valid or current as someone who is currently studying. Like if I look at my kinesiology degree, the things that I learned when I graduated from my kinesiology degree in 2000, well, 25 years later, they're teaching a few things different now than they did back then. And so I find it curious that you just have to apply for a new one and you automatically get another 5 years. Then if that's the case, then just make them valid for 10 years, right? That's interesting. But yeah.
I had a similar experience for my wife, and she used to have an ECA when we immigrated back in 2020. She needs now one for her professional designation, and essentially you just pay $100 or something similar, and then they reissue the certificate within a couple of days, couple of weeks, probably most. So I would suspect that this might be a correct way to approach it, but again, as Mark mentioned, Ryan, perhaps you would want to book a consult before we can give you a definite answer. All right, so this one is a good one from Marco. Canada saw a surprise 10% rise in temporary foreign workers in early 2025, challenging Ottawa's goal to cut their share of the population below 5%. Curious on your thoughts on this. So who wants to take this on?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are getting pushed out, and so statistically, they're trying to do different things to keep tabs on who's coming and who's going, and I think that's more locked down than it ever has been now, because we actually have not only a levels plan for our permanent residents, but also a levels plan for our temporary foreign workers, and so it might be that the measures that they took they're finding that it's not quite clamping down in terms of the rate or the pace that they thought it might be. But I would suspect, at least based on the consults that I'm hearing and what's happening for people on the ground, that a lot of people are getting pushed out right now, and they're just not able to stay because they're running out of time. Their work permits are expiring and they don't have a way to renew them.
So my thoughts on this are how they are defining the statistics, like how they're interpreting the statistics. And I say define because what is a rise in temporary foreign workers? And where have traditionally all of the temporary foreign workers, a large portion of them, come from? The ranks of international students. And so each of these are dominoes that kind of fall one after another after another. And when you have millions of international students that come, and just because they said, okay, starting now, we're going to reduce them, doesn't mean there isn't a whole pile in the queue waiting to be processed. So the numbers of international students have not been dropping significantly over the last few years, despite the measures that they are taking. Eventually, it will catch up. But those individuals are still going through school and are still graduating, and are still applying for postgrad work permits and increasing numbers. So remember, some of them may be in, anywhere from 1 to 4-year programs or longer, or decide to double up their programs or whatever it might be. And so I think one of the factors that's attributing this 10% rise is just international students applying for postgrad work permits. And Alicia's really good at her job. So although the government is trying to get everybody to leave, Alicia, she's right there to help people navigate all of the options that are available, realistic options. One of the things I think all of us do when we have these consultations is we examine everything. We look at every possibility, and then we give real advice. And if you go read the Google reviews, the recent ones, because you'll see lots of people reporting they were honest. They told me that, the information they gave me was honest and forthright. They didn't tell me what I wanted to hear. They told me what I needed to hear. And then I was in a position to make good decisions. And that's why, the consultations we're doing with people, we see as much value in just helping them to understand where they're really at, as anything else. And it doesn't serve anyone any good to say, oh yeah, you can just file this application or this application. It'll buy you time, or it'll allow you to keep working, when in the end, it's a dead end. So, yeah. So Marco, I think I don't put any stock really in that stuff, because we know people are leaving. We know people are running out of time. That's why we created our whole Time's Up series back in the fall and started trying to educate people so they can make good decisions. We knew that as 2025 rolled around, that there was going to be issues. Now, has there ever been more people applying for H&C applications in the history of Canadian immigration? No. Has there ever been more refugee claims filed? No. Has there ever been more TRP or open work permits filed, or even C10 work permits, or whatever it might be? People are looking for every possible avenue to be able to stay, because they've got so much invested in Canada. And as immigration lawyers, our job is to help people in their darkest times, when they have very, very few options that they can see in front of them. And sometimes we affirm, what they believe, that there is no hope of being able to stay. And that's just as important as telling someone, hey, there is a possibility if your employer will support you to get an LMIA, even though that process is even a cumbersome, painful process given the processing times. So just my thoughts on that.
Absolutely. All right. And then the next one is, again, a super chat. So this one is from Zahir. So Zahir has 1 year experience as a department manager. And if he switches jobs and gets 6 months in construction, will he be able to apply for permanent residence under the Express Entry trades category?
Maybe, Zahir. Maybe. At the end of the day, 6 months is what's required. But I will advise you, I've got a procedural fairness letter I'm responding to for someone this afternoon. We're working with them to craft a response. And this is round 2 with them, because IRCC effectively said, you're not a carpenter. You at best, you were a trades helper. To go from no experience or limited experience into a trade, and then all of a sudden be working at that trade level, even regardless, like even if there is no red seal or trade, certification to practice in that occupation, you need to show that you've got prior experience. To just step in and say, I'm a carpenter, and then, accumulate those six months or whatever it might be, you have to be able to show that there's a foundation for it. Because otherwise, IRCC, and they know everybody's trying to wedge themselves into these category-based sections, right? Otherwise, they will see you as a trades helper. Another factor is your wage. So in this case, I've seen people who are being paid on the very low end of the trade, and in some cases even lower than where the job bank suggests the wages are for that occupation across the country. And all of those things are factors that are going to come into play here, Zahir.
Okay. And then we have one from Akash. So let me just pull it up. He sent it separately. So Akash is wondering, I have an expression of interest profile with 80 points, so I assume this is in Alberta, not code 5, and permit expiring on November 2025. So Akash did not get selected for both draws from tourism, which had 73 and 72 cutoff points. And what are these suggestions? Akash,
Igor, Could you shift? Yeah, you book a consult, Akash. But could you? I want to show Alberta's processing right now. Can you shift to it, Igor? And let's just take a quick look. So I was in our local immigration partnership. I'm on one of the chairs of our working employer working group, and we had this discussion with a number of employers on the call. People need to understand the reality, and it's not just Alberta; it's every province. Okay. So if you look right now, you can see the total number of nominations on the left is 4,875. That is almost 5,000 less than they had last year. The provinces were in this mode of accepting people in preparation for the allocation they'd receive the next year. So they'd always accept a few more at the end of the year than maybe they had nominations to fill, because they knew they would be processed and then issued the following year when the quota came in again. But when Minister Miller sliced the quotas in half, it put the provinces in a very difficult spot because they had so many people in the queue. So you can see there the nominations issued for this year, 2,077, I think it says. The nomination spaces remaining are 2,700 and change. And how many are already in the queue waiting to be processed? More than they have room for this whole year. But then let's jump down and just go to the AOS for a second, Igor. I just want to show the AOS here. Okay. So you can see for the expression of interest system, and that's the one I meant, the expression of interest AOS. Yeah, so Alberta is instituted like like BC, Ontario, similar expressions of interest because they have so many people that want to apply. So you can look here. I'm not sure exactly when this was last updated, but we have virtually no spaces available for 2025. And we have 37, almost 38,000 people who have submitted an expression of interest through just the Alberta Opportunity Stream. At least that's the one that they've chosen for themselves when they submitted their expression of interest. And in fairness, some people may have, depend on how they answered the questions, they may not even be eligible for anything, but they're still in there as a statistic. But each of these categories, Alberta, it doesn't mean that Alberta is not going to issue. What it means is they are going to focus on their priority streams. So you can see how many people. Accelerated Tech has over 3,000. Family Connection has over 2,000. Law enforcement is just an anomaly. It's just weird. And then the priority sectors, like healthcare, those have over 3,800. But we know that people are still receiving nominations, right? Especially through healthcare. We know that because Prem himself, his wife, has received a nomination. We're super excited to see that. At least an expression of interest. They received an invitation to apply. And so we know that they're still coming. So new ones are being issued, even though we have people still in the queue, but they are picking those they feel are going to be the most important, and healthcare is way up there on the list. And so we might have a bunch of people in the queue, but they're still going to choose, and processing times are just going to continue to be off the charts. And that's the same for all provinces.
Yeah, and to answer Akash's question, like maybe Igor, you can go to the most recent rounds of notifications of interest, because this is what people get confused about. So just like Mark was saying, you can put your profile in there. You have thousands of people that have theoretically a profile, but there's nothing in the Alberta system that actually screens you out based on eligibility. So when you get a notification of interest, it literally tells you, go look at the notification of interest round and see if you fit the eligibility parameters, because it's possible you might not fit the eligibility parameters. So Akash, if you had 80 points in your EOI, but you weren't getting a notification of interest on a tourism draw, it's because they can pick and choose certain elements. They can say, we're going to do a tourism draw, but we're only going to do it for people who have this tier level or these knock levels, or that are working in rural locations. So they can kind of pick and choose, and that is probably why you're not getting that notification of interest, because they decide exactly who from that group they want to give that NOI to.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna pull up Mark on the screen because there's a comment specifically addressed to Mark.
Sure.
Okay, so Mark, this is this one. You can read
Oh,
it.
Majid.
Mark loves to help people and guide them to the right path. The best example is the English language learning departments that helped us learn and integrate into the Canadian social environment.
So what Majid is talking about is every Tuesday evening, we offer free language classes, beginner, kind of entry level, kind of level 1, 2 English classes at our local ethnic center here in Lethbridge. And so my wife are kind of principals of the school, and it's completely free. The firm kind of covers the cost of the rental of the facility and things like that. And we have a bunch of students that are, we have some volunteer teachers, and we have kind of our vice principal over the teachers. We've got another vice principal that helps connect students with local community members to help them practice their English outside of the classes. And just a wonderful group of volunteers and people just trying to be good neighbors and to help people as they're trying to, integrate into Canadian society. And so, Majid, my pleasure, my friend. Majid is officially kind of graduated. He's moving on, and we're excited for him and for his family.
Awesome. Okay. One last super chat in the queue. So Vijay says, I'm on a closed work permit, laid off due to shortage of work, have experience in construction, professional not code 710, an easy to find job. However, employers argue about high wage LMA processing times. What are the options? And perhaps to discuss the options.
So Vijay, this is not a good situation, right?
No.
When you're on a closed work permit, it means it's employer specific. And so you can only work for the employer on your current work permit. If you want to transition to a new employer, they need to go and get a new LMIA in most cases. So if you're looking at construction professionals, this is not one where you can usually try to find any sort of free trade agreement or IMP. So you're looking at the temporary foreign worker program, you're looking at LMIA streams. And unless you can find an employer who has already applied for an LMIA, like the most recent LMIA processing times that we are seeing on the ground are 10 months to 12 months. So literally those applications have been sitting with the ESDC for a year before they make a decision. And then you still need to go and apply to change the conditions on your work permit. And unless you actually get interim permission to work for the new employer pending the new work permit, assuming that LMIA was granted to you, you can't work for that new employer. So this is a not a good situation, because especially if those employers are not even going to look at filing a new LMIA, you're looking at like a year and a half before you might be able to work. And so you can't work without authorization. It's a breach of your work permit conditions. And if IRCC suspects that you have been working with unauthorized, then they actually are prevented from giving you a new work permit for 6 months since the last unauthorized period of work. So please, please, please do not work without authorization. Make sure that you are doing this properly, because you don't want to jeopardize your future immigration options.
Yeah. And this is a real, we're in a real difficult situation right now. So we know since the pandemic and, maybe a little bit before, inflation was rising in our country. And so everything is more expensive. Housing, food, all of the things that we need to live are more expensive. And at the same time, our labor market has been flooded with open work permit holders, individuals, good people, just like you, Vijay, that have followed all the rules, done everything that you need to do, but there are just so many of you. And it's created a situation where there's a race to the bottom in wages. And so you have employers who are looking at what the government says the prevailing wage should be, and then having to pay that to get an LMIA, where in reality right now the wages are often considerably lower. Because if you've got 10 people and everybody is desperate to find a job, and there's only so many jobs to go around, it's quite ironic. Like you see so much. This is where I don't understand the stats, Alicia, because there are so many. I guess the unemployment rates are as high as they are because the labor market is really been flooded. And so employers, lots of employers that I talk to, they say, oh, the wage, I have to pay that much. Well, there's 3 or 4 other open work permit holders that I'll just employ them, and they'll work for minimum wage. Why should I pay $30 to this carpenter when I can get someone who'll work for $15 in Alberta? Like that's the world we're in, unfortunately.
And the other thing I would say to VJ is if you are currently on an LMIA, right, depending on what kind of closed work permit you're on, your employer might be offside. They might have breached their conditions under the LMIA because if they said they were going to employ you for a certain period of time at a certain wage rate, they're not allowed to lay you off under the terms of that LMIA. So, sometimes if it's seasonal work or if there's like a work stoppage due to unforeseen events, they might actually have a temporary layoff and be able to rehire you and then pay you back the wages that they ought to have owed you. But they might have a compliance issue, right? They might get investigated by ESDC for failing to comply with what they agreed to under the LMIA. So, there are hotlines where you can call and ask about what your rights are as a foreign worker and whether your employer is breaching those rights under the agreement and the type of work permit you were issued.
And I just wanted to share an anecdote. Yesterday we went to downtown in Calgary, and I think like 5 stores that I used to go to in downtown Calgary closed.
All
Um,
closed.
Atmosphere right across the
Yep.
street from Mech is
Yep.
closing. They have a huge sellout on their,
Yeah. Atmosphere closed down here too. Yeah.
and so many people lose their jobs. And I cannot help but think about the people who rely on this employment as part of their PNP applications that take like 22 months, and you have to be so certain that your employer meets the eligibility requirement and is in good standing so that at least you have this employment for like whatever 22 or 100 months that they take to process the application. It's just so cruel, and it's very unfortunate that we have to go through all of this in our economy. Okay, on a good note, wanted to pull this comment from Spidey, our faithful follower. Spidey, be careful driving and listening to this live Q&A because some news may give you a heart attack, and you don't want to get that. Okay.
Indeed.
All right.
Drive
Next
safe.
one is from Alvin. So, what do you guys think about 1 year post-grad work permits? Do they still work? Would you advise people against going for 1 year programs?
Since the beginning of time, Alvin, not recent time, since the beginning of time, I have never advised anyone to go to school for just 1 year to get a 1 year postgrad work permit. Even in the best of times, it was really hard to secure permanent residence in that short period of time. So if your end goal is to work and then obtain permanent residence, under no circumstance would I ever study for 1 year. And any education agent or any consultant or any advisor out there who's advising you that it's a good idea to study for a year and then get your postgrad and you can get PR is lying to you. Simple as that.
Unless you're a francophone.
Yeah. Unless you have some other pathway. Mm-hmm.
Or unless you have a time machine and you can move back to 2020.
Good point. Yeah.
Where you would get 1 year post-grad work permit, then you would program stack, and then you would get 18-month extension, and then another 18-month extension.
Yeah.
Without that time machine, it's probably not going to work.
Yeah. And I get it. I talk to clients and they tell me what their tuition is, and we see the letters of acceptance, and it's so expensive. And I understand why people can only put together the amount of tuition for a 1 year program when you're looking at international tuition fees. But Mark is absolutely right. I have never recommended that people do a 1 year PGWP because it is almost impossible. By the time you have graduated, you get your letter of completion, you submit your PGWP application that same day, you would have to have a job lined up in a high skilled occupation. You would have to make sure that you get to the day 52 weeks 1,560 hours of work in a high skilled job, that you don't have any hiccups, that there's no layoffs, that you don't have anything unforeseen that happens in your life, and then that magically you have enough CRS points, or maybe you have some other pathway to apply for permanent residency, but it is almost impossible to pull off.
Yeah, and let's be realistic. 1 year of Canadian work experience will probably not be a decisive factor.
Not be enough. Yeah.
Okay. So next one is from Felix. Felix says, I've created the dummy expert entry profile a couple of times with 406 in my CRS score, waiting for my master's degree. Now everything is lined up, and I understand Felix is ready to receive an ITA. Would he need to include a letter of explanation explaining his dummy expert entry profiles?
Okay, just to clarify, we need a definition of what dummy EE profile is. So, like you say, you have a new IELTS. Hopefully, everything wasn't just all fake. Like you had no proper IELTS, you just entered in random numbers, or, I'm not sure. Because there's a difference between submitting a profile where you know you're going to have to update it because you will have new education, higher education, or you've rewritten the language test and you've got a better score. So that's just a matter of updating. And if your profile expires, it's not a big deal. But I think we need a little bit more information here, Felix, on what you refer to as dummy. If you have entered information that is just different or incorrect, absolutely, you're going to try to explain that, because they will scrub through everything in your history and they will absolutely say, well, you listed this work history as this occupation or this title, and now you're saying that work history for that company is this title. Well, which is it? And they'll question the legitimacy of it.
Okay. Next one is good. This one is from Hassan. So the work permit, it's not an extension, it's the work permit interim authorization letter. Says that Hassan is authorized to work until August 13th or until a decision is made, or whichever is first. So what happens if there is no decision by August 13th? Does he lose his legal status on August 14th or not?
And Igor, there's actually like a frequently asked questions section from IRCC specifically on this. So you can search that. If you can't find it, Hassan, look for it. But IRCC specifically says, okay, look, the law still applies. And so if you had valid status, you applied for a new permit before your status expired, it was a complete application, you paid all your fees, everything was complete in that application and it was proper, then the law still follows. You're still authorized under maintained status. But what they started doing was giving these little letters that say, hey, our projected processing times are 6 months right now. We're going to give you a letter that says we don't, you just have status for 6 months in case employers are asking or in case healthcare agencies are asking. But what actually is the case is it's confusing people, and people are now saying, oh, well, is it the date on this letter or is it the date that I get a decision from IRCC? It is the date you get a decision from IRCC. So Igor pulled it up. You can take a look. It is clearly, it's not the date on the letter. It is the date that you get a response back from IRCC. But the problem is, sometimes your driver's license will expire, sometimes your provincial ID, sometimes, well, your social insurance number especially will expire because you've got a temporary number and it's linked to your work permit or your study permit validity. And so if that expires, then often the provinces say you don't have healthcare. And so this is where you've got to try to negotiate with the province or the healthcare facility to say, look, I do have maintained status, but this does for sure become a practical problem.
Yeah. All right, perfect. So next one is from Vida. So Vida says, my PR application is still in progress. At this stage, I've received an invitation to access pre-arrival services. Does this really mean anything?
Yeah. This is just a natural part of the evolution of applications. And it doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to get permanent residence, but it does mean that you're advancing through the system in a positive way. And I've seen these invitations go out at almost every stage of the process. But ultimately, it's a positive sign that things are on the right track, but it's not a guarantee that there isn't something else that they're going to find, because we've seen that. So,
yeah. And then this one is also very good from Hassan. I'm not sure if that's the same Hassan or a different Hassan, but Hassan's asking, when a foreign national enters their 90-day restoration of status period, do they become illegal right away, or are they considered overstaying, or both, or what does that mean?
So as soon as your status expired, you are technically an overstay. So you're not supposed to be there if you no longer have valid temporary authorization. However, we do have this 90-day restoration period. That 90-day restoration period, you've got to be really careful in terms of how you calculate it. There are so many different variations. I was helping somebody on a really complicated file because a lot of people, especially if you're a student, don't realize that even though you have a study permit that says that it is valid, let's say until July or the summer after your courses are done as a student, the study permit is normally issued for longer than your course of studies. But when you look at the regulations, specifically Regulation 222 sub 1, it literally says that your study permit ends on the period 90 days after you completed your studies. And so that's not in July. It might be earlier if you did an accelerated program or you graduated earlier. And then take note of that, because it may not be the expiration on your permit itself. It might be earlier based on the regulations. But in that 90-day window, let's say you've calculated it correctly, you've got 90 days to try to do that restoration application. You've got to make sure you pay those extra fees. So it's like $237 and something, or if you're doing a work permit, it's slightly different. But take a look at those restoration fees. You've got to check the box on your application, the IMM 5710, to actually restore, as well as pay the fees, and then make the argument about why you're restoring. And take a look at the restoration sections of the regulations, because there are certain things that you cannot fix, that you cannot restore. But in that period, you're technically without status. And it's only if they actually grant you that restoration that they kind of backdate your status to say it's okay.
All right, perfect. We'll move on to the next question, and this one from Joker. So Joker's asking, what are your thoughts on the pause in the draws this week? Can we expect more CC draws? What's happening? Why they're so short? Why they invite only 500 people? So many people have this question. So perhaps one of you can take this question and answer.
All right, Joker. Numbers are numbers. And when the government feels that they have the numbers that they need, then the only two kind of valves that they have to turn down are to not issue nominations or take longer to process applications. So you could see the last CEC was a very small number because they feel they are on track to get to where they need to be. Just like the provinces, who have a tendency to take more in a year, and whether it's extending invitations in a year because they know that many of those people are not going to land until the following year. That is also a factor at play here. Now, they made a shift with the annual levels plans to focus on category-based draws, kind of, and in Canada applicants, so theoretically CEC, but there's also been a heightened emphasis on French. So all those have played a role in the rounds of invitations. But what you have to understand is that there's always individuals from the previous year that are looking to land in this year. And the government has to stick with their levels plans. And so if they feel they already have a large cohort of people that are in the queue that are going to be finalized this year, and they've said we are going to reduce the overall numbers by basically 100,000, then those numbers are going to result in them issuing fewer, invitations. Now, ultimately, on the economic side of things, the numbers really didn't drop from last year to this year when we look at overall express entry applicants. But the government, they're being cautious. They know that they have a number of issues they have to deal with, including this, the things that led them to make the very draconian decisions they made last fall and earlier to prevent people from extending permits and their desire to have people leave. And so with the CEC draws, I expect that we will have more CEC draws, yes. But it's not going to be at the levels that we had last year. It's just not.
Well, let's see. So we do have 2 super chats lined up. The next one is from Nabil. So Nabil says, have you seen any cases of misrepresentation bans on a dummy post-grad work permit extension applications?
It's interesting that they define them or people now are rallying around the concept that these are post-grad work permit extensions. They were never treated as that. It's only because the vast majority of people doing it are on post-grad work permits. This is simply just filing a dummy work permit extension application to try to benefit from maintained status. And I have never seen anyone, being found to have misrepresented themselves when they're submitting these applications myself. But Alicia and Igor, have you guys seen anything or any pushback from IRCC? Obviously, they're going to get refused. Because there's no foundation for issuing, the work permit. And some people try to claim, well, I was able to get it. Well, if there was any kind of a positive approval on that type of an application, it's because an officer made a mistake. It was an error, because you can't just file just an application and the irony is, I saw this law firm in Edmonton, and it was a law firm who had, I guess it was the articling student, who'd filed one of these for a client that came to us after, and tried to put a whole bunch of other H&C kind of factors and things in, but they didn't include a temporary resident permit, which is kind of what you try to do if there are extenuating circumstances or humanitarian or compassionate factors at play. But just filing a bare bones open work permit application. Oh, and I also heard someone saying that if you're on visitor status, you could apply for one of these. I'm like, oh my goodness, the lies that are just spread out in internet land. But no, I've never seen an outright misrep, but once it's refused, you're done. Like,
Well,
even
and
if
the
you're
risks.
trying to restore. Yeah.
Go
Go
ahead,
ahead,
Igor.
Alicia.
Go ahead.
We all have
I
things
was
to say about this.
I was just going to say the risks for misrepresentation are quite high, right? Because depending on what you've said the reasons are for this extension application. So the PGWP extension makes me mad. There is no such thing. So there is only a recapture of time if your passport is expiring. So if you actually had a eligible program of studies and you were entitled to a longer period under your PGWP, if your passport expired too early, you would do a recapture of time. And that's what it's called, a recapture of time. It is not an extension of a PGWP. We had a number of temporary public policies that gave specific under Section 25 extensions, but it wasn't an extension of a PGWP. It was just a temporary public policy. So the risk on filing a fake application, one that you know is doomed to failure because you are not entitled to it, the risk on misrep on that, I think, is relatively high because you have to go through all of your previous applications. You've got to be honest in describing everything, and you still have to show you have some sort of temporary intent. And so if you say something in there that is misleading or that could lead to an error in the administration of the act, it is possible that immigration could allege misrep against you. So, filing these sort of doomed applications is not something that that we help with, but we do know that people do it.
Yeah. And perhaps here again, the risk of the application being returned as having no basis means that you essentially lose your status the very same day when your existing or previous work permit or study permit expired. So be very careful with that. As we're trying to wrap this up, I'll pull up one last super chat and then we'll do a little blitz, trying to go through as many questions as we can. So did I hear that right? Isn't the company not allowed to lay me off if I have an LMA? I have a GTS work permit.
So just to clarify, companies do have the ability to lay people off. But if they are laying people off and then trying to get new people in through a new LMIA, good luck with that. So I've got a situation where there was an individual who was on an LMIA-based work permit working for an employer. I'll just keep it generic because I don't want to get too specific. It'll kind of make me angry. This employer laid them off on their LMIA and said, no, we don't have work for you. But really what they were doing is they realized that the IEC program, International Experience Canada, would allow them to bring more workers from Holland who would work for $15 an hour on their farm versus having to pay this client $19 an hour. And so unless they're actually lying on a future temporary foreign worker program application, they would not be able to get a new LMIA if they hadn't complied with the conditions and were, not honoring their obligations with the first individual. So, Alicia, I don't know if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, so if a company has gone through the process of an LMIA and has given you that job offer and you have that LMIA, they ought not to be firing you during that period of time unless there's some sort of employment standards code justification or Sometimes there's like force majeure clauses where they can say there's some massive change in circumstances, like during COVID, for example, where a company literally couldn't operate because of public restrictions to operate, and then they had to lay people off, and there was not very much they could do about it. So the company is technically not supposed to lay you off, and so they would be in breach of their obligations with ESDC, and then they would have to self-report to ESDC, or ESDC could investigate them, and then they would have to show a justification for why they laid you off, and they might get fined if they can't prove a justification. So they have to follow employment standards codes. They should not be laying you off if you are under an LMIA, but sometimes they have to, or they do, in which case they're offside with ESDC and they have to show a justification to ESDC. But yeah, it leaves workers in a really tough situation if that does happen.
Perfect. And I think this is a good segue for us to enter the last part of this live Q&A.
The most dangerous part of the Q&A for Alicia and I, trying to give quick, fast answers to questions.
So this one will go to you, Mark. Okay, so I'll pull.
Sure.
So Shamini asks, if applying under FSW program through Express Entry with a job offer in Canada, without a job offer in Canada, and having French CLB7, how to show proof of funds?
Same way you would under any federal skilled worker application. So if you're not eligible under CEC, you're applying under FSW, then you need to have the letter from the bank, that has all the key information. We cover it all in the course, in our Express Entry Accelerator course. We have templates. We've got a whole bunch of things to help, but banks have to show that there's, they have the average balance over the last 6 months. It shows the account number. It shows you. It shows, a breakdown of your assets and your liabilities, even, which many people overlook. So when you're proving funds, you have to hit the minimum level, the settlement fund level, for however many people are in your family. And so in the course, we have specific lessons in Module 6 in particular on settlement funds, proof of funds. And so I encourage you to take a look at the course, and lots of good resources in there to help. Or you can book a consult with us and we can walk through it. But yeah, there's a very clear expectation that if you're under a federal skilled worker, and you don't have a job offer, then you are required to provide proof of funds. Yeah. So although you have French and it's the golden age of Francophone immigration, they probably won't waive that for you. Although I'll be honest, Alicia, there sure seems like a double standard with Francophone applicants these days. I can't tell you how many procedural fairness letters I've seen for Francophone applicants when they have had massively glaring omissions in their Express Entry application. So golden age, learn French, folks. That's the moral of the story.
All right. The next question goes to Alicia, as she could have guessed. So this one is, I would like to know, I obtained the diploma of higher technician in computer network and telecommunications, but I do not have enough experience, and I would like to immigrate to Canada to have a better living condition. How do I do it? Alicia, what would be your recommended strategy?
Yeah, and so Armel, this is where we would say, please book a consult, because we just need to know so much more about your age, your marital status, what other education language you might have, what your opportunities are. But in general, this is tough slogging. So if you are not inside Canada, if you don't have Canadian work experience or Canadian education, if you don't have a spouse who's Canadian and you don't speak French, it's going to be super hard. So some things would be trying to find, well, are you from a country where you have a free trade agreement, where you could try to come to Canada and work in Canada with a Canadian employer if you can find a Canadian employer, and if you are from a country that has a free trade agreement with Canada, and try to kind of get your foot in the door, get some Canadian experience, see if you might have a pathway to PR. But it is super tough if you don't have any connection to Canada and if you don't have French, just because it is so competitive and the points are so high right now.
Okay. And Alicia, don't relax yet, because you got one more question. So Omar has already applied for postgrad work permit, year 1, 1-year contract, and a spousal open work permit extension. In the case the main applicant gets laid off, do they need to update RCC, or do they lose the eligibility for spousal?
Yeah, and this is a really tough question, Omar, because the timing of everything really matters. So, in general, if your spouse actually has that spousal open work permit, then the fact that the anchor relative lost their job doesn't necessarily cancel the spouse's open work permit, but you do have an obligation to notify IRCC of material changes in circumstance. And this is where your records of employment matter. And so any Canadian employer is going to have an ROE. So at the end of your employment, you will have that ROE, that record of employment. And it is usually a tax document, but it is shared with IRCC eventually. And so CRA and IRCC talk, and you have an obligation to notify. And usually your employer has an obligation to notify as well about an end of employment. And so you do need to be honest and tell IRCC, hey, I'm not working anymore. And so this is where you want to find another job as soon as possible so that when you notify them, I'm not working in this job, you can hopefully notify them right away. I found another job. It meets the Tier 1 eligibility criteria. It's going to be valid for 16 months in your work permit, and it shouldn't hopefully affect that spousal open work permit. But the timing all matters, because if your spouse hasn't received that spousal open work permit and you get fired before they actually get the work permit, that can jeopardize the entire application, your application and the spouse's application. So it really depends on time.
Perfect. And the next question goes to Mark. So before I pull up the question, here's a
Joe.
comment from Joe. Joe
In my
followed
second week.
advice and started studying French. So slow progression, but working onto it.
Mhm.
All right. And Mark, here's your question from Levine. Can someone
Okay.
be admissible temporarily but inadmissible for permanent residence?
Levine, I'll need more context than that. Can someone be admissible temporarily but inadmissible for PR? I need to understand more context on that. Like if you're inadmissible, you can get a temporary resident permits to overcome that inadmissibility that allows you to be admitted to Canada temporarily. But in the end, you're still inadmissible for permanent resident purposes until you actually obtain rehabilitation on that. So I need more information on that, or at least context.
Okay. Who wants to take on this question from Clevy? Clevy's medical expired in September 2025, but the PR application is still pending. If Clevy receives another request to redo the medicals, how long they will be valid for?
So, okay, it depends on whether you've actually submitted a complete EAPR. So if you have a complete EAPR, then and you submitted those medicals and they were valid, then they should be valid for the term of the application, unless the officer says we want new medicals, in which then they could do that. So if they ask for new medicals, then you'll need to get it to them. Make sure that you do so within the time range. Sometimes they only give you 7 days or 30 days maybe to get those new medicals. You've got to book it right away. If you have those new medicals, the medical results are usually valid for 1 year from the date that they were issued. So they should be valid for another year. There is a temporary policy in place that sometimes IRCC on Express Entry will accept older medicals, but take a look at the public policy because it has to show that there's no clear medical risk. There's no like medical surveillance for TB or something that's showing up on that.
Okay. And Alicia, the next one goes to you because you've dealt with something similar recently. Please explain spouse accompaniment when filling the Express Entry profile. So wife is in Canada, but the husband does not want to include her in the profile just to get more points. Is that a misrepresentation? And perhaps to help you answer this question, I'm going to pull up this response from the IMREPs.
Yeah. And so, Igor, you can read this and the answer. So, read the answer section.
Yeah. So, Express Entry candidates are responsible for ensuring that the information in their profile is accurate and up to date at all times. Questions must be answered truthfully, and information must not be omitted or manipulated in order to gain additional CRS points. What you've described, and that refers to this question, but also to your question, Zeus, what you've described as an act of intentional misrepresentation in order to gain additional CRS points. A permanent resident or foreign national is inadmissible for misrep, for directly or indirectly misrepresenting or withholding material facts. Please be advised that the assessment of an application is based on a case-by-case basis. And the onus is always on the applicant to provide sufficient documentation.
In other words, you better have a pretty good excuse or rationale for why you listed it the way you did. Otherwise, we could absolutely find misrepresentation and bar you from Canada for 5 years.
Yeah. And Alicia, perhaps you can add something else from your experience.
Yeah. So basically, going through a similar situation with people who booked a consult, but yes, in order to try to manipulate the system to get more points for the principal applicant, it is not okay. It is not acceptable just to list the legally married spouse who is in Canada as non-accompanying. So IRCC has said that they view that as misrepresentation. Don't do something that's going to be misrepresentation.
Okay.
Solid advice.
Yeah. So the next one goes to you, Mark. So if one applies for a 3-year work permit but have 2 years validity on the passport, what will be the outcome and what would be your advice?
Well, the outcome is they will only issue the work permit to the validity of the passport. So if the passport is only valid for 2 years, they'll issue the work permit for 2 years, and then you will have the ability to apply later once you obtain a new passport, to recapture the balance of the 1 year. And that's, generally speaking, that's a paper-based application, and there's a specific way of doing it. But that's how you do it so that you can obtain the full 3 years you're entitled to.
Okay. And the last question for today also goes to you, Mark. So do we need to explain all major transactions in our savings account in the proof of funds document? I received a second ADR for proof of funds, despite showing high funds balance and credit card statement.
Rohit, I'd be ringing the bell right now, Igor. Rohit, if you have received a second ADR on this issue, this is a huge thing because they do not believe the funds are actually yours. What they're anticipating is that they're either a loan or someone has given you money. With all of the all of these show money scams out there where people are pulling money together just so that they could put it in a bank account. It's a mess. So you want to, without any reservation, you want to book a consult so that we can look at it and figure out what the real issues are. Like I said, I've got one I filed the other day. I've got another one I'm reviewing this evening. And IRCC, it's no holds barred. Like they're cracking down because they're seeing high rates of fraud. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Okay, I'm anticipating that there are higher rates of fraud that are just that are pushing them to really crack down on people. Prior immigration histories. They're scrubbing applications. They're looking for ways to refuse applications. And you've been given a lifeline here to try to resolve it. And there are significant steps that you need to take to be able to prove that those funds are actually yours and they're not somehow a loan or not truly available for your settlement in Canada. So I recommend you book a consult.
Yeah. And just as we wrap this up, a quick reminder how to reach out to us. So you type in holthelaw.com, you get to our website, and then you can click the button called Speak to a Lawyer, and then you choose the lawyer who you want to connect with, and we have 2 durations, 25-minute consults and 50-minute consults. We have different availability, so just go and check our calendars and then book a consult. But if you cannot afford the consult, or you can afford the consult, but you want a little more hand-holding submitting your Express Entry application or a TRV application, you can also go to our Canadian Immigration Institute website, and we have DIY courses that will guide you step by step through the whole process of preparing and submitting an application. I will not give it any adjectives in terms of like strong application, the best application, or the application that's bound for success, because the decision is always made by the officer. But we'll tell you how to make sure that you do your very best in preparing this application and avoid very common mistakes. On this note, I think it's a good time for us to end this live Q&A and say goodbye to everyone until next Wednesday, where we will reconnect once again at 10 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time. I see lots of people saying thank you. We thank you all as well for your wonderful questions. And for those of you whose question was not answered, please just wait until we reconnect again, because we were not made of rubber. Like, we cannot accommodate everyone, but we're trying our best. And
Yeah.
we're trying to pull up the questions that are the most helpful to as many people as possible.
Indeed.
All right. Any last comments, Mark, Alicia?
No, thanks everybody. This wouldn't be possible without all of you.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
Okay. Bye-bye.